In today's lesson, we are going to be rounding decimals. So first we need to take a look at what a place value system is. Basically, it's a system that gives a name to each number according to their place value. So here you can see we have a fairly large number, and we have a decimal point right here, followed by 1427. When we round decimals, it's very important that you find the decimal place value and then you pay attention to the directions so you know where you're rounding to. So let's take a look at this number again, and to be sure that everyone understands that each of these has a name, we're going to take a look at this 4. This 4 right here, if you take a look above, it's pointing to the hundredths position. That means that that 4 is in a position called hundredths. The 2 is in thousandths, and the 7 is in 10,000ths. The 1 happens to be in the tenths place value. So as we start to do some example problems, you want to make sure that you're looking at the directions and know what place value you are being asked to round to. Okay, so I have quite a few examples here, but let's take a look at these two very basic rules right here. Those rules are what we need to make sure that we follow in order to round correctly. So when you're rounding decimals to a particular place value, you have to follow two basic rules, and they're right here. If the number to the right of the place value is 5 or greater, you're going to round one number up. If the number to the right of the place value is 4 or lower, you will just leave it as it is. The most important thing for you to follow are the directions, because they will change depending on the problem you're doing. So in this one, we are rounding the following numbers to the tenths place value. Now the tenths place value, if I go back to this screen, notice it's the first place value following the decimal. So let's go back then and take a look at 2.52. So the number 5 right here is in the tenths place value. So we want this number to stop at the tenths place value. Well, because we have a number in the hundredths place value, we need to look at it to know what to do. So we're always going to look to the right of the place value of the number we want to round. So in this example, this 2, that is a number that's either 4 or lower. It happens to be a 2, so we want to leave this 5 just like it is. So rounding 2.52 to the nearest tenth place value would give us 2.5, and we're done. Now if this number had been a 5 or greater, we would have taken that 5 and rounded up to a 6. But since it's a 2, we get to leave it as 2.5. Let's take a look at the next number. We have 61.56. Since we are rounding to the nearest tenth, once again, we want this number to end with this 5, because that 5 is in the tenths position. So we're going to look next door at its neighbor, and it's a 6. Since that is a 5 or greater, we round this 5 up 1 to a 6. So our answer would be 61.6. Now the reason why we follow these rules is because this 6 right here makes this number 61.5 closer to 61.6 than it is to 61.5. That's why we round it up here. Let's take a look at the third example. Now the number that's in the tenths position this time is this 2. So we want the number to stop at that 2. But in order to decide if we're going to round this to a 3 or leave it as a 2, we have to look next door. We're only going to look at its neighbor 8. Now because it's an 8, that would fall into this category. It's a 5 or greater, happens to be an 8, so we round this 2 up one more to a 3. Our answer is 15.3. And that's because this number is closer to 15.3 than it would be to 15.2. And that's because we've got 81 right here. So that makes that number closer to 15.3. In the next example, we have 98.222. Well, the number in the tenths position happens to be this 2 right here, because it's the first number after the decimal. So to decide where to round it, we always look at 1 next to it and to the right. And since that's a 2, that would fall into this rule. It's a 4 or lower. So we get to leave that one as 98.2. Let's look at a few more examples then. In this example, looking at the directions, we're going to round to the nearest hundredth position. So we're no longer looking at the first number following the decimal. That's the tenths position. We want to look at the hundredths now. So in all of these, we're going to be looking at the number, the second number after the decimal. So that one's in the hundredth spot. So whatever the directions tell you to look at, you need to look there and then look next door to it to decide how to round. So, because there's a 6 next to the hundredths position, I'm going to round this 2 up to a 3. So this answer would be 2.53 instead of 2.52. And that's because there's a 6 in the thousandths position. I always look next door to whatever the directions tell me to. In this example, again, we are rounding here, so we're going to look next door. Since that's a 2, we get to leave that 6 alone. So my answer is 61.56. Again, we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, so we want to stop where this 8 is. I've got to look next door to see if I'm going to round to 9 or leave it alone as 8. Since this is a 1, I'm going to leave it alone. So this becomes 15.38. In the last example, it's this 2 that's in the hundredths position. So I look next door to the thousandths to decide where to round. Since this is a 2, I get to leave this one alone. So my answer is 98.22. Final examples, again, we're going to round to the nearest tenth. So I'm trying to make sure that you're always paying attention to the directions. In this number, the 3 is in the tenths position, so I want to round it to here, but I do have to check out its neighbor to see if it's a 5 or greater. It's not, so I'm going to leave it as 1.3. In this example, the 9 is in the tenths position, so I look next door. That number happens to be a 0, so I get to leave it alone as 211.9. In this example, we have a decimal right here. The 4 is in the tenths position. I still look next door. Because that is a 7, I'm going to round that 4 up to 5. This 0 right here is really just a placeholder. It's just to make sure you see the decimal. So the 4 does become a 5 because that 7 is 5 or greater. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Make sure you're always following the directions so you know where to round. Find that position and then look next door to it. Okay, good luck.